It started with something so ordinary that I almost laughed when I saw it, a thin red slip of paper flapping beneath the wiper blade of my car. At first glance, it looked like a parking ticket, the kind you'd get for staying too long on a busy street. But as I plucked it free, the bold black letters across the top made my chest tighten. It wasn't from the city. It was from the Homeowners Association. The notice said my lawn was unmaintained and visibly unappealing to the community's standards. A warning had been issued, and if I didn't rectify the issue within 7 days, a fine would be applied. There was even a picture printed at the bottom, my front yard, captured in broad daylight, showing nothing but a few dry patches of grass near the mailbox. It was absurd. I took pride in my home. The grass was trimmed, the hedges were neat, and the driveway clean. I'd seen worse lawns on the same street, yet somehow mine had been singled out. That small red slip set off something in me, not anger at first, but confusion and disbelief. By evening, I noticed others walking by slower than usual, glancing toward my house. I began to feel like I was under a magnifying glass. The HOA president, a man named Robert, was known for his obsession with community image. He was the type to measure fence heights with a ruler and send reminder emails about trash can placement. The rumor was that he didn't even own his home, he rented it from his brother, yet acted like he ruled the entire block. A few days passed, and I decided to let it go. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the satellite image on their system was outdated. But then, exactly 1 week later, another envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a fine, $250 for failure to comply with landscaping maintenance expectations. The tone was smug, the kind that assumes guilt before you even open it. I walked outside that morning and stared at the yard again. The grass wasn't perfect, sure, but it was just grass. The sun had been brutal that summer, and a few patches of brown weren't unusual. Still, I couldn't shake off the feeling that this was personal. Maybe Robert didn't like me. Maybe he didn't like my car parked in the driveway instead of the garage. Maybe he just needed a new target. That night, I sat down with the HOA handbook. It was a thick document filled with contradictions, rules written by people who loved control more than reason. I flipped through the section about landscaping, reading every word carefully. And that's when I noticed it, a vague line that said, all visible yard areas must be kept neat, clean, and consistent with the community's appearance. There was no mention of what consistent actually meant. No color codes for grass. No requirement for specific plants. Just neat, clean, and consistent. That line stuck in my head like a splinter. The rulebook didn't say I had to have grass. It just said the yard had to look neat. And that realization began to spark an idea, a small ember of defiance that quickly grew into something much bigger. The next weekend, I drove around the neighborhood, paying closer attention than ever before. There were houses with gravel patches, others with artificial turf, and even one with a small section of paving stones instead of grass. None of those owners seemed to have red slips or fines. Why me? I started to notice a pattern. The houses closest to Robert's corner looked immaculate, not just well kept, but over-manicured. Perfectly trimmed bushes, identical mulch colors, and identical flagstones. Every one of those homeowners had either been on the HOA board or were friends with Robert. Farther down the street, the houses looked normal, like real people lived there. Lawns with small brown patches, kids' toys on porches, seasonal decorations. It felt like two worlds existing in the same community, Robert's kingdom and everyone else's reality. That week, I received another email from the HOA, final notice. Failure to comply will result in escalated fines and potential legal action. It felt like a threat, over grass. But instead of panic, I felt a strange calm settle in. Something inside me clicked. If they wanted to play by the book, I would play by the book, but in my own way. I wasn't going to argue or beg. I wasn't going to pay another cent for a rule that didn't make sense. Instead, I was going to follow their rule to the letter, and show them exactly how ridiculous their system was. I spent the next few days researching landscaping alternatives. I looked up drought-resistant yards, minimalist designs, and zero-grass options. I even called the city to confirm zoning laws. Everything pointed to one possibility that made me grin. Nothing in the HOA rules forbade concrete. In fact, one clause said durable, low-maintenance surfaces were encouraged as long as they maintained visual harmony. That was all I needed to see. The decision was made. Over the following week, I got quotes from contractors. Most of them were confused when I explained that I wanted to remove all the grass and replace it with smooth, stamped concrete. One even asked if I was opening a car wash. But I didn't care. Every time I imagined Robert's face when he saw the new lawn, I felt a spark of satisfaction. By Friday, the deal was sealed. The crew was scheduled to arrive Monday morning. I marked the area, cleared the sprinklers, and sent a polite email to the HOA letting them know I was beginning a full front yard renovation in accordance with community guidelines. I attached the exact section of the rulebook that supported my project. That weekend felt strangely peaceful. I watered the lawn one last time, watching the droplets glisten in the sunlight. There was something poetic about it, the calm before the storm. When Monday came, the sound of machinery filled the air. Neighbors peeked through blinds as the crew dug up the entire front yard. Within hours, the grass was gone, replaced by fresh gravel and wooden frames ready for concrete. By noon, Robert himself appeared at the corner, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching in silence. I pretended not to see him. As the gray surface began to take shape, I realized there was no going back. This wasn't just a petty act of rebellion anymore, it was a statement. I had followed every rule, dotted every I, and still turned their system upside down. The satisfaction was indescribable. By sunset, half the yard was poured and smoothed. The wet concrete shimmered in the orange glow of the fading light, almost like a mirror reflecting the absurdity of it all. The workers would be back in the morning to finish the rest. That night, I stood at the window, watching the surface harden under the moonlight. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm again. The fine didn't matter. The warnings didn't matter. I was taking control, my way. What I didn't know, though, was that by the next morning, my quiet act of defiance would ignite a neighborhood war that no one saw coming. The next morning arrived with the quiet hum of anticipation. The concrete workers were back before sunrise, their trucks parked neatly along the curb. The rhythmic scrape of tools and the low murmur of voices echoed through the street. The air smelled of dust, cement, and the faint tension of curiosity, because by now, everyone knew something unusual was happening at my house. Neighbors who usually hurried off to work lingered a little longer at their doors, pretending to check their mail while sneaking glances in my direction. Even kids on their bikes slowed down as they passed, whispering to each other like they were witnessing something forbidden. By mid-morning, the entire front yard was transformed. Smooth slabs of light gray concrete stretched from the porch to the sidewalk, clean and seamless, catching the sun like polished stone. It wasn't just neat, it was perfect. There were no weeds, no patchy spots, and definitely no unmaintained grass. The workers added subtle stamped patterns near the edges to mimic stone texture, making the whole thing look elegant and deliberate. When the last truck pulled away and silence settled over the neighborhood, I stood on the porch and admired the result. It was simple, practical, and, most importantly, completely within the rules. That piece lasted about 2 hours. Around noon, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy shoes on concrete. When I looked outside, there he was, Robert, the HOA president himself, clipboard in hand, wearing a look that could curdle milk. He stood on the curb, his eyes scanning every inch of the yard like a detective inspecting a crime scene. He took pictures, measured sections with a tape, and scribbled furiously on his clipboard. His lips moved as he muttered to himself, clearly trying to find something, anything, that violated the rulebook. I didn't step outside. I didn't need to. I watched from behind the curtain, calm and quiet, as he paced up and down like a man realizing he just lost control of his favorite game. Eventually, he knocked on my door. I didn't answer. I didn't need another confrontation or a fake smile followed by another fine. Instead, I let him leave whatever paperwork he wanted at the doorstep. After a few seconds of hesitation, he slid a folded note under the door and stormed off. When I finally opened it, the note wasn't an official notice, just a handwritten message. Expect an inspection tomorrow morning. You are in violation of Section 4.3, Unapproved Modifications. I read it twice, then smiled. Section 4.3. I already knew what it said. It referred to exterior modifications that alter the structure or color of the home. Concrete wasn't part of the house, it was landscaping. And landscaping changes didn't require prior approval, as long as they complied with the general aesthetic. Mine did. I'd read the rulebook enough times to quote it. Still, I knew what was coming. Robert wasn't just enforcing rules, he was defending his pride. To him, I hadn't just changed my yard, I'd challenged his authority. The following morning, a white SUV marked HOA Property Services parked across the street. Out stepped 2 people, Robert of course, and another man wearing a neon vest with a clipboard and camera. They didn't even bother knocking. They began their inspection immediately, snapping photos, pacing the length of the property, pointing at the concrete like it was a sinkhole threatening the community. I stayed inside, sipping coffee while watching from the window. Their voices carried faintly through the glass. Robert's sharp and frustrated, the inspectors more hesitant, uncertain. It was clear the second man wasn't convinced anything was wrong. He kept glancing at the printed rules in his hand, probably realizing that everything technically checked out. After about 20 minutes, they left, though not before Robert took one last long look at the yard, his jaw tight and shoulders tense. By evening, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one was formal, printed, sealed, and stamped with the HOA logo. I opened it slowly, already anticipating what it would say. Notice of violation, unauthorized alteration of property. They were accusing me of making a structural change to my property without approval. The letter demanded that I restore the front yard to its previous condition within 14 days, or face escalating fines and potential legal action. It was almost funny.
Restore it? As if I could unpour concrete.
I read the entire letter twice, then placed it neatly in a folder along with every notice and rulebook page I'd saved. My plan wasn't just to fight this, it was to win methodically, one rule at a time. The next morning, I sent the HOA an email with every citation they'd misapplied. I attached photographs, documentation, and the exact page numbers proving my project was compliant. The email was calm, professional, and undeniable. There was no room for interpretation, just facts. For a few days, there was silence. The kind that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Neighbors started asking questions. Some came by just to see the yard up close. Most of them loved it. One woman said she was thinking about doing the same to avoid mowing. Another neighbor said it actually made the street look cleaner. It didn't take long for word to spread. Soon, half the neighborhood knew about the conflict. Some whispered that Robert was furious because I'd embarrassed him in front of the board. Others said he was trying to rewrite certain HOA clauses to prevent anyone else from doing the same thing. Then, one morning, a new notice appeared, not just on my door, but on the community bulletin board near the entrance. It was a special meeting announcement. The HOA board would convene in 3 days to discuss unauthorized yard modifications and future policy enforcement. The wording was generic, but everyone knew who it was about. I felt the tension build again. The entire street buzzed with speculation. Some people were quietly cheering for me, while others avoided eye contact, afraid of being seen taking sides. The night before the meeting, I walked outside one last time to look at the finished concrete under the porch light.
It was flawless.
Smooth, clean, and harmless. Yet it had managed to turn an entire neighborhood upside down. I wasn't nervous about the meeting. I had everything documented, every rule, every receipt, every email. What I didn't realize, though, was that Robert had been preparing something too. Something more aggressive. Something that would turn a petty rule dispute into a personal battle. When I woke up the next morning, there was a fresh envelope taped to my front door, this one stamped urgent in red ink. Inside was a copy of a formal complaint. The HOA was claiming that my parking lot style surface was negatively impacting community property values.
It was absurd.
But this time, I knew it wasn't about rules anymore. It was about ego, and I was standing directly in its way. The days leading up to the HOA hearing felt strangely heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. The neighborhood had fallen into a rhythm of quiet gossip, whispered conversations at mailboxes, lingering glances at my house as people passed by. Every step across that smooth, gray concrete now seemed to echo louder than it should have, like the sound carried meaning beyond footsteps. The official notice had been clear. The HOA would hold a special hearing to determine whether my front yard violated community standards and if further action was warranted. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at the community clubhouse, the same beige building where the board hosted barbecues and holiday events. By Friday evening, I had gathered every document, email, and photograph into a neat folder. It wasn't just preparation, it was protection. Every notice they'd ever sent, every rule I'd quoted, every time-stamped picture of my property, all lined up like ammunition. That night, I slept lightly. My mind kept replaying the possibilities. I knew Robert wouldn't go down quietly. He had built his identity around authority, and I had chipped a piece of it away.
For him, this wasn't about concrete anymore.
It was about control. When morning came, the sun was bright but the air was cool. The clubhouse parking lot was already half full when I arrived. I parked along the curb and walked slowly toward the entrance, noticing how some neighbors turned their heads away while others nodded subtly, as if wishing me luck without saying it aloud. Inside, the room smelled of coffee and freshly printed agendas. A long table sat at the front, occupied by 5 members of the HOA board, each with stacks of paper and small nameplates. Robert sat in the center, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes flickered when he saw me. The rest of the chairs were arranged in neat rows, half of them filled with residents. I recognized familiar faces, the family across the street, the retired couple next door, even a few people who rarely attended meetings but had clearly come for the drama. When the meeting began, the HOA secretary read the agenda aloud. The second item was discussion, property at Lot 47, front yard modification.
That was me.
Robert leaned forward slightly as the secretary finished reading, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He began by summarizing the situation, using words like non-compliance, unauthorized modification, and community aesthetic disruption. His tone was polished, professional, and dripping with subtle accusation. He spoke as though I had single-handedly threatened the integrity of the entire neighborhood. He presented photos, the same ones I'd seen him take, showing my concrete yard from different angles. Then, with a small flourish, he produced what he called a petition from concerned homeowners who supposedly believed the new design would hurt property values. I scanned the list of names and recognized only two of them, both from Robert's side of the street. When it was my turn to respond, I stood calmly and laid out my folder on the podium. I spoke slowly, letting every word carry weight. I pointed out the sections of the HOA rulebook that specifically mentioned durable, low-maintenance surfaces as acceptable landscaping. I explained that no rule required grass, plants, or soil. I presented the photos, receipts, and city zoning confirmations. Everything was clean, legal, and properly documented. The board members exchanged quiet glances as I spoke. A few nodded slightly, clearly seeing the logic. But Robert didn't move. His face remained unreadable, though his hand tapped the table, an impatient rhythm betraying his frustration. When I finished, he cleared his throat and shifted tactics. He started talking about neighborhood harmony, about how certain changes could disrupt visual consistency. It wasn't about rules anymore, it was about taste.
Opinion.
Personal preference disguised as authority. The room fell silent as he spoke. For a brief moment, I could almost see his confidence return. But then, one of the other board members, a woman named Diane, who lived 2 streets over, leaned forward and asked him a simple question. She wanted to know exactly which section of the bylaws I had violated.
Robert hesitated.
It was only for a moment, but the pause was enough. Diane pressed further, reading aloud the same rule I had quoted in my email. The words hung in the air like a quiet verdict: durable, low-maintenance surfaces permitted, provided they maintain visual consistency. She looked up from the paper and then at the pictures. The concrete was smooth, light-colored, and bordered by the same decorative stones as before.
It wasn't flashy. It wasn't ugly. It was just different.
When no one else spoke, Diane said softly that she didn't see a clear violation. Another board member nodded in agreement.
Robert's jaw tightened.
He tried to regain control, insisting that the change required pre-approval, but his voice had lost its authority. The discussion dragged on for nearly an hour. Residents occasionally chimed in, some defending me, others staying neutral. But as the conversation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that Robert was standing alone. His arguments sounded desperate now, reaching for any justification that might stick. Finally, the board voted.
3 against, 2 in favor.
The motion to penalize me was denied. My yard as it stood was compliant. The words were simple, but the impact was massive. For a moment, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. Robert sat back slowly, eyes distant, as though he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Around the room, quiet murmurs spread, a mixture of relief and disbelief. The meeting ended soon after, but the shift in atmosphere lingered. People avoided looking at Robert as they filed out. A few stopped to congratulate me quietly, shaking my hand or giving a small nod of approval. It felt less like a victory and more like a quiet rebellion that had just succeeded. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer than before. I walked back to my car, folder in hand, heart steady but proud. I hadn't just protected my property, I'd proven that their authority had limits. But victory, as I'd soon learn, doesn't always mean peace. Over the next few days, things began to change in subtle ways. The HOA stopped sending me emails, but I started noticing little inconveniences. My garbage bins weren't being collected on time. Flyers I left on the bulletin board were removed. And once, when I parked my car near the mailbox, I found a fresh scratch across the door, small but deliberate. At first, I dismissed it all as coincidence. Maybe I was imagining it. But then, one evening, I came home to find something taped to my front door again. It wasn't a notice this time. It was a printed photo of my house, taken at night, with the words "You've made a mistake" scrawled across the bottom. It wasn't official. It wasn't from the HOA. But I knew exactly whose handwriting it was. The petty war was over, but a personal one had just begun. In the days that followed the HOA hearing, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood. the kind that hums quietly before something breaks. The board's decision had been final, and on paper, the matter was closed.
My yard was compliant.
The fines were cancelled. The HOA could not touch me. But victory didn't taste like peace.
It started small.
The garbage truck skipped my house for the first time in years. The cans stood untouched on the curb while every other bin on the street was emptied.
The next week, it happened again.
When I called the waste management office, they said my address had been marked as service suspended due to homeowner request. I hadn't made any such request. A week later, a notice arrived from the city, an anonymous complaint claiming I was running a business from my home without a permit. It was laughable, but still required a formal inspection. The officer who came by was polite and apologetic, explaining that these reports were rare and often neighbor-driven. It didn't take a detective to know who was behind it. Robert had lost the public battle, but he hadn't accepted defeat. He had simply changed tactics. What he couldn't control through the HOA, he would pursue through nuisance and manipulation. Soon, little inconveniences became patterns. My mailbox was left open after deliveries. Flyers appeared on my windshield warning against unsanctioned home modifications. Someone began leaving HOA newsletters on my doorstep every single morning, sometimes 2 or 3 copies stacked on top of each other. It was harassment, but subtle, the kind that leaves no fingerprints, just enough to unsettle. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that the best revenge was indifference. But there's only so long you can pretend not to notice when you're being watched. One evening, as I took out the trash, I caught movement near the side of the house. A shadow slipped behind a tree. By the time I walked over, whoever it was had vanished. The next morning, there were muddy footprints near the edge of the yard, not deep but fresh, pressed into the thin layer of dust on the concrete. I installed motion-activated cameras that same weekend. 2 on the front porch, 1 above the garage, and 1 facing the street. It felt paranoid, but necessary. If Robert or anyone else wanted to keep playing games, I wanted proof. The footage the cameras captured over the next week was illuminating.
Most nights, nothing happened.
But on Thursday, around 11:40 p.m., the camera facing the street caught a figure walking by slowly, tall, lean, wearing a dark jacket. He stopped in front of my house for nearly 30 seconds, staring at the yard. Then he bent down near the edge of the sidewalk and placed something small near the mailbox before walking away. When I checked the spot the next morning, I found a small card, a business-style note that read, "This neighborhood has standards."
No name. No logo.
Just those 5 words. It was both ridiculous and unsettling. That weekend, I attended a neighborhood barbecue, one of those community events that the HOA loved to host to maintain the illusion of unity. I went not because I wanted to socialize, but because I wanted to see Robert face to face, out in the open.
He was there, of course.
Standing near the grill, laughing too loudly, holding a clipboard even at a casual event. When our eyes met, his smile faltered for just a second, a flicker of recognition that betrayed everything he was trying to hide. He knew that I knew.
And he didn't care.
Over the next month, things escalated. Someone filed another anonymous complaint about improper drainage from my property, claiming runoff from the concrete might affect nearby lawns. The city inspector came again, and again found nothing wrong. Still, the constant interruptions began to wear me down. Every knock on the door felt like another round in a fight I hadn't started but now couldn't avoid. But Robert wasn't the only one watching. Other neighbors, the ones tired of his overreach, began noticing the pattern too. Some had their own grievances with him: petty fines, unfair rules, condescending emails. A quiet alliance began to form, not formal but understood. We didn't talk much, but there were knowing nods, small exchanges of sympathy, the kind that say, "You're not alone in this." One afternoon, Diane, the board member who had questioned Robert during the hearing, stopped by. She didn't stay long, but she mentioned something important. There was talk within the board of reviewing Robert's behavior, especially after multiple residents had lodged complaints about his conduct. Apparently, the HOA's power wasn't absolute. Even the president could be voted out if enough evidence surfaced. That small spark of hope rekindled something in me, not anger but purpose. I began collecting everything. Every notice, every photo, every recorded instance of interference. The security footage, the anonymous letters, the complaint records, all neatly organized, dated, and backed up twice. By early fall, my folder had become a full case file. And then fate handed me the final piece I needed. One of my cameras caught something unexpected. On a windy night, just after midnight, Robert himself appeared in the footage. He walked right up to my property line, bent down, and placed something under the mailbox. When he walked away, I paused the frame. His face was partially visible in the light, unmistakable. When I checked the spot the next morning, I found a small plastic bag filled with clippings of dead grass. A message written in marker across the plastic said, "This is what your yard should look like."
It was petty. Juvenile.
But it was also undeniable proof that he was targeting me personally. I didn't react immediately.
I didn't even tell anyone.
I simply added the evidence to the folder and waited. Because by now, I knew exactly what I needed to do, and how to do it without breaking a single rule. Robert had declared war quietly, in shadows and whispers. But my response would be public, loud, and completely within the lines of the HOA's own laws. When the next community meeting was announced, I signed up to speak. Just one item on the agenda: homeowner grievances regarding HOA conduct. Robert didn't know it yet, but the game he started was about to turn against him, in front of everyone he'd ever tried to control. The night before the meeting, the air felt heavier than usual. The kind of heaviness that only comes before a reckoning. I went over my notes one last time, checking every detail, every timestamp, every screenshot neatly printed and organized in a black binder. It wasn't just a defense anymore, it was a presentation, a timeline of hypocrisy and harassment that could no longer be denied. When the morning came, the neighborhood hall filled slowly. Familiar faces took their usual seats: retirees, families, newcomers, and the ever-watchful eyes of the board. At the center of it all sat Robert, poised as always, his signature clipboard resting on the table before him like a badge of authority. He smiled as residents greeted him, shaking hands, pretending to be the benevolent leader he imagined himself to be. He didn't know what was coming. When the meeting was called to order, Robert's tone was the same confident one he always used. He opened with budget updates, landscaping proposals, maintenance schedules, all the usual distractions. But then came the final item on the agenda. Homeowner grievances, he announced, scanning the room. We have one registered speaker. Mr. Taylor. My name echoed softly through the hall.
Heads turned.
Some faces lit up with curiosity, others with knowing smiles. I stood, binder in hand, and walked to the podium. For a moment, I let the silence settle. The tension in the room was thick enough to feel.
Then I began.
I started from the beginning, the fine for my ugly grass, the letter that started everything. I described how I complied with the HOA's rules exactly as written, replacing my lawn with concrete, a fully approved and code-compliant alternative. I kept my tone measured, factual. Every sentence built on the last, not as a complaint, but as a record. Robert shifted slightly in his seat. His smile faltered for the first time. I continued. I explained the retaliation, the garbage suspensions, the fake city complaints, the repeated notices. With each example, I held up supporting documents. Screenshots of emails, letters, and photos. The audience began to murmur softly, whispers spreading like ripples in water. Then came the video evidence. I connected my laptop to the projector and played the security footage, the clip showing Robert walking up to my property late at night, leaving something beneath my mailbox. The moment his face appeared clearly in the frame, a collective gasp rolled through the room. Even the board members exchanged glances, their expressions tightening. When the footage ended, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The silence spoke for me. Robert cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. He called it a misunderstanding, claiming he was checking for compliance concerns. But the damage was done. His voice shook slightly, the mask cracking. Diane, sitting 2 seats away, leaned forward. She asked Robert directly whether he had filed any of the anonymous complaints to city officials. His answer was a fumbling denial, one that no one believed. The room had shifted. The authority he once commanded had dissolved under the weight of evidence. The other board members began whispering among themselves, passing papers back and forth. The audience, once quiet, now murmured openly. For the first time, Robert looked small, cornered by his own arrogance. When my allotted time ended, I simply thanked the board for listening and sat down. The room erupted in quiet applause, not loud or chaotic, but steady, genuine, and sharp enough to sting. What followed was something I hadn't expected. One by one, other residents began standing up to speak. Each had their own story: small fines, petty warnings, unfair treatment, and intimidation. Some mentioned Robert by name. Others simply described a culture of fear within the HOA. By the time the final homeowner finished, the board called for an immediate private session. The rest of us waited outside in the parking lot, buzzing with a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. The very people who had once been silent were now united by a shared experience, and a shared frustration. After nearly an hour, the doors opened again. The board members returned, their faces serious but calm. Diane stepped forward to speak. She thanked the residents for their honesty and patience. Then she announced that, effective immediately, Robert was being suspended from his position as HOA president pending formal review. The board would hold a vote within 2 weeks to decide whether to remove him permanently. The room broke into applause. Real applause this time, loud and unrestrained.
Some people stood.
Others simply smiled in disbelief. Robert sat motionless, staring down at his clipboard as if it could still save him.
I didn't celebrate. Not yet.
I simply gathered my binder, nodded to Diane, and left quietly. Outside, the evening air felt lighter than it had in months. For the first time, the neighborhood didn't feel like an enemy territory. But while the board's decision was a victory, it wasn't the end. In the days that followed, Robert's absence was noticeable. The constant warnings and newsletters stopped. The tension that hung over every street began to lift. But there were still traces of unease, like the ghost of an old storm that hadn't completely passed. Rumors spread that Robert was trying to rally support behind the scenes, reaching out to old allies, trying to twist the narrative. He told anyone who would listen that I had set him up. That I was manipulating the neighborhood. Some even believed him, though most didn't. I didn't bother defending myself. The truth was already out there, and it was stronger than any rumor. As the vote approached, the HOA's tone shifted completely. The meetings became more transparent, the communication more respectful. Diane took charge temporarily, implementing small but meaningful changes. For the first time, the homeowners felt heard. But I knew Robert wouldn't leave quietly. People like him rarely do. There's always one final move, one desperate attempt to claw back control. And as the date of the vote drew closer, I began to notice signs, small, almost imperceptible, that he was still watching. A car parked too long near my house. A mailbox left slightly ajar. A single dead patch of grass placed in my driveway one morning, no note, no explanation.
The storm wasn't over.
It was only gathering strength again, for one last strike. The day of the vote arrived like a long-awaited verdict. Weeks of tension had boiled into a single evening, and by sunset, nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood had gathered at the community hall. The lights inside flickered softly, and the low murmur of voices filled the air, the kind of restless energy that comes when people sense something big is about to end. Outside, the sky hung low and gray. It felt like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. I sat near the back, away from the board's table.
I didn't need to speak tonight.
I had already said everything that mattered. This time, it was up to the community. Robert arrived late, walking in through the side door with that same forced confidence, chin high, shoulders back, pretending he hadn't already lost control. His clipboard was gone, replaced by a single folder tucked tightly under his arm. The crowd went quiet as he passed.
No one greeted him.
The silence spoke louder than any confrontation could. Diane, now acting chair, called the meeting to order. Her tone was steady but firm. The agenda was brief. One item only: vote for HOA presidential removal. She read the formal charges: misuse of authority, harassment of homeowners, falsified reports, and conduct unbecoming of an elected representative. Every word echoed in the hall like a gavel strike. Robert's jaw clenched tighter with each accusation. When she finished, he stood to make his defense. His speech was exactly what I expected: polished, self-pitying, and dripping with justification. He claimed he had only been protecting the neighborhood's integrity. He said I had embarrassed the HOA publicly, that my concrete yard was a mockery of community standards. He even suggested the video evidence was misinterpreted. But as he spoke, something had changed. The room didn't react with nods or polite silence anymore. They stared, cold, unblinking, tired of the act. The applause he once commanded had turned into stillness. When Diane opened the floor for comments, no one defended him.
Not one.
Instead, voices rose one after another. Neighbors who had been fined unfairly, others who'd been threatened or ignored. Some had been silent for years but now spoke with conviction. Their stories weren't angry, they were tired. Tired of fear. Tired of walking on eggshells in their own homes. When the comments ended, Diane called for the vote. Each homeowner raised a small card, red for removal, green for retention. From the back, I watched as a sea of red slowly filled the air. One after another, arms lifted high. Only 2 cards remained green. The rest glowed crimson under the hall lights. Robert didn't wait for the official count. He stood up, gathered his folder, and walked out. No words, no farewell. The sound of the door closing behind him was like the final punctuation of a story that had dragged on too long. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. After the meeting, people lingered outside. Conversations were lighter, laughter came easier. Some neighbors who had avoided each other for months finally talked again. The air carried a sense of relief, the kind that only comes after surviving a storm together. But for me, the real closure came a few days later. I was in my driveway, sweeping leaves off the concrete when a black car rolled up quietly. Robert stepped out. He looked different, tired, unshaven, smaller somehow. For a moment, I thought he might start another fight. Instead, he just stood there, staring at the yard that had started it all. He didn't speak, and neither did I. After a few seconds, he gave a short nod, not of apology, not even respect, but of recognition. Then he got back in his car and drove away. That was the last time anyone in the neighborhood ever saw him.
Weeks passed.
The board held new elections. Diane became the official president, and under her leadership, the HOA changed completely. The rules were rewritten with fairness in mind, transparency replaced secrecy, and neighbors began volunteering for projects instead of avoiding them. The HOA newsletter, once filled with threats and warnings, now featured community events, local recommendations, and even homeowner spotlights. The tone of the neighborhood transformed. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful.
And the concrete yard?
It stayed exactly as it was, smooth, clean, and unapologetically gray. At first, I thought I might replace it one day, maybe plant something to soften the look. But over time, it became more than just a patch of ground. It was a reminder that standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting loud, sometimes it means refusing to be pushed down quietly. Every now and then, new residents would ask about it. They'd hear whispers of the lawn that ended the old HOA. I'd just smile and say it was a long story, one that started with a red slip of paper and ended with the neighborhood taking back its voice. Because in the end, the revenge wasn't the concrete. It wasn't the fines or the exposure. The real revenge was peace, the kind of peace that comes when you stop letting bullies define your home. And so the street fell silent again. Not the tense silence of fear, but the calm of normal life returning. Kids laughing, sprinklers hissing, doors opening to friendly waves.
The war was over. The lawn was gone.
And for the first time in a long time, it finally felt like home.